Imagine risking your life in freezing waters to save a stranger, only to have your own world turned upside down. This is Jake's story, and you won't believe where it leads. For as long as I can remember, the wilderness has been my sanctuary. My name is Jake, and life in the remote Alaskan town of Homer has always suited me, even if it's not for everyone. This small town of about 300 people rests quietly by the water, with its rows of wooden buildings and just a couple of gas stations, an old diner named Maggie's Place, a grocery store that doubles as a hardware shop, and a modest little bar called the Rusty Anchor, where the fishermen gather in the evenings. I left behind a life of chaos and noise a few years ago, seeking solace among the mountains and the sea. I moved out here in my mid-30s, but now, at 37, I'm accustomed to the solitude. I live a simple life, chopping wood, fishing, and always keeping an eye on the weather. Days blend into one another, and that's the way I like it. This lifestyle became my escape from everything I'd left behind. Here, surrounded by mountains and the sea, I found a peace that had long eluded me. I relocated to this secluded part of Alaska about 5 years ago, and mostly keep to myself. Most days, I stick to my cabin, working with my hands, making furniture from driftwood that washes up on the shore. It's a quiet existence, but one I wouldn't trade for anything. The town, however, always pulls me back when winter is approaching. With the harsh season closing in, it was time to make one of my rare trips to town to stock up on supplies. As I docked my small boat one cold morning, I unexpectedly slipped and fell into the icy water. That's when Sadie, a young woman who helps out at the docks, came running over to help. She's around 21 years old, with light brown hair often pulled back in a messy ponytail. Sadie's always there when I arrive, though I try to maintain a respectful distance. She's friendly, but much younger than me, and I know her family wouldn't appreciate me getting too close. Despite the age gap, it's clear she has a bit of a crush on me, but I've always felt she deserves someone her own age. As I hauled myself out of the water, shaking from the cold, she asked, "You okay, Jake?" "Yeah, I'm fine," I grumbled, embarrassed by my clumsiness. I glanced over my shoulder, trying to regain my dignity, and that's when I noticed the reckless driver. Suddenly, a boat sped into the dock area, causing a large wake. The wave crashed against the pier, and before I could even warn her, Sadie lost her balance and was thrown into the water. Instinct took over, and I dove in after her. The shock of the freezing water hit me, but I managed to swim over and grab her just as she started to panic. I glanced back at the speeding boat, catching a glimpse of a few people laughing as they passed by. Their indifference fueled my anger, but my priority was getting Sadie back to safety. I dragged her over to the dock, and one of the older fishermen helped pull her up, while I used a cleat to hoist myself out. The water was around 36 degrees, and we were both shivering uncontrollably. We needed to warm up fast, and I knew just the place. The best option was the shower on my cabin cruiser, the Seawolf, which was anchored nearby. It had a full water tank and a generator for hot water. "Go get Angela," I called to the fisherman, referring to Sadie's mother. "Tell her Sadie fell into the water. She's on my boat, and we'll be in the shower warming up." "You got it, Jake," he nodded, moving faster than I'd ever seen a man his age move. Shivering uncontrollably, I managed to stand, and then bent down to pick up Sadie, who was curled up and shaking. I didn't have much time before I'd be too weak to move myself. Carrying her to my boat, I started the generator and hurried her to the lower cabin. I stripped off her wet clothes and pushed her under the warm water, turning the shower on full blast. She leaned against the wall as I stripped down to my boxers and stepped in, rubbing her arms and legs to get her blood circulating again. The cramped shower stall made it awkward, but I kept moving, kept rubbing her back and shoulders, determined to get us both warm. After about 10 minutes, I could see some color returning to her cheeks. I decided to step out, leaving her under the hot water. My hands shook as I struggled to light the stove to make us something warm to drink, and that's when Angela appeared in the doorway. "What the hell happened?" she demanded, looking between Sadie and me. "She fell in," I explained, my teeth chattering. "We both needed to warm up quickly. I'll make hot chocolate." "You get back in the shower," Angela commanded. "I'll handle the rest." She looked at me sternly. like I was still some foolish kid. You almost froze out there. Nodding, I stepped back into the shower where Sadie was still shivering, but at least she wasn't in shock anymore. Your mom's here, I told her. She'll have dry clothes for you. She gave a weak smile. You saved my life, Jake. Let's not make a big deal out of it, I replied, trying to deflect the gratitude I saw in her eyes. Just keep moving your arms and legs. We need to stay warm. A few minutes later, I heard the deep voice of John, Sadie's father, as he boarded my boat. John was in his mid-40s, a broad-shouldered man who always seemed a little intimidating, but I respected him more than anyone else in town. He knocked on the cabin door, waiting before he entered. Is she okay? He called out. Yeah, she's fine, I answered, stepping out of the shower and wrapping a towel around myself. Just needed to warm her up. John nodded but said nothing, his eyes moving between Sadie and me. I could see the concern etched into his face, mixed with the relief that his daughter was safe. Sadie, still leaning against the shower wall, was beginning to look more like herself, the shock fading from her expression. Thank you, Jake, Angela said, handing Sadie some dry clothes. We'll take it from here. I nodded, moving out of the way and giving them some privacy. I pulled on a pair of jeans and an old sweater, grabbing the steaming mug of hot chocolate Angela had already prepared. My hands still shook, and it felt good to hold something warm. You're lucky you didn't freeze to death, John said, looking me up and down. I appreciate what you did. We owe you. I shrugged, taking a sip of the hot chocolate. She would have done the same for me. He grunted in acknowledgement, but the gratitude was clear. Angela wrapped a blanket around Sadie and led her off the boat, back toward their truck. Before she left, Sadie turned back and gave me a small wave, her eyes still full of gratitude. Thank you, Jake, she called out softly, her voice catching a bit in her throat. I just nodded, not trusting myself to say anything more. As they walked away, John turned back to me. Come by the house for dinner tomorrow. Angela will make that stew you like. It was as close to an apology or thanks as I'd get from John, and I nodded. I'll be there. After they left, I went back to cleaning up my boat, trying to shake off the lingering chill. Ben, one of the local fishermen who'd seen the whole thing, strolled over. Well, look at you, saving the day, he said with a grin. Yeah, don't start, I muttered, but I couldn't help the small smile that tugged at my lips. The way Sadie looks at you, Ben continued, ignoring my protest, it's clear you've got a fan. She's just a kid, I replied, shaking my head. She's not a kid forever, Ben said, giving me a knowing look. Might want to think about that. I shook my head, dismissing him with a wave. I've got enough to think about. Maybe, he said with a chuckle. But life has a way of throwing things your way when you least expect it. I finished up and headed to the general store to grab the rest of my supplies. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened with Sadie, but I tried to push it from my mind. I knew that if I allowed myself to dwell on it, I'd just end up more confused than I already was. Inside the store, I noticed a group of people talking, and I caught snippets of their conversation. Hollywood actress, scouting for her new movie, one of the women was saying. Yeah, and did you hear she almost killed someone? Another replied, her voice full of gossip-fueled excitement. Probably too busy staring at herself in the mirror to steer properly, the man at the counter grumbled. The name Rachel caught my ear. I'd heard about her. Rachel Carter, the actress who had apparently come to Homer to scout for her next film. It was all anyone could talk about lately. I didn't pay much attention to that sort of thing, but it sounded like she'd caused a bit of trouble on the water today. You should meet her, Jake, said Steve, the guy behind the counter, who always seemed to know everyone's business. She's about your age, and from what I hear, she's looking for a real man. I doubt she's looking for anyone in this town, I said, grabbing a sack of flour. And I'm not interested. Why not? Steve leaned forward on the counter, looking at me intently. Could be a bit of fun. You've been out here by yourself for way too long, man. I'm fine, I said, more sharply than I intended. Steve just shrugged. Suit yourself. As I headed back to my boat, I thought about what they'd said. Rachel was probably used to getting her way, used to people falling all over themselves to impress her. The thought made me roll my eyes. But as I stepped out onto the dock, there she was, standing by my boat, arms crossed and an irritated look on her face. She was taller than I expected, with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun and sunglasses perched on her head. She didn't look like she belonged in Homer, with her designer coat and polished boots, but there was something about the way she held herself that made me pause. "You're Jake, right?" she asked, her voice carrying a bit of that Hollywood edge I'd heard so much about. "Yeah," I replied, frowning slightly. "And you are?" "Rachel Carter," she said, as if I should have known. "I need to talk to you." I sighed, not in the mood for whatever drama this might bring. "About what?" "About the fact that you jumped into the water today," she said, her tone suddenly serious. "You saved that girl." "It's not a big deal," I said, brushing her off. "Just did what needed to be done." "You could have died," Rachel shot back, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine concern in her eyes. "But I didn't," I replied. "And if that's all, I have things to do." She stood there for a moment, studying me, before she shook her head. "You're really something. You know that?" "So they tell me," I said dryly. "Now, if you'll excuse me." "Wait," she called as I turned to go. Thank you for doing what you did." I paused, glancing back at her. "You're welcome." She looked like she wanted to say more, but then she just nodded and walked away, leaving me standing there, wondering what that was all about. I returned to my cabin that evening, feeling more drained than usual. As I unloaded my supplies, I couldn't help but think about everything that had happened. The chaos of the day, Sadie's grateful eyes, Rachel's unexpected concern. I tried to shake it off, but it lingered like the chill from the icy water that morning. The following day, I kept myself busy around the cabin, chopping wood and making repairs to the small shed where I stored my tools. I tried to shake off the thoughts of yesterday, but they kept creeping back in. Sadie's eyes, Rachel's unexpected visit, the way John had invited me to dinner. It all felt like a whirlwind. In the late afternoon, I decided to take my boat out again, just to clear my head. The water was calm, and as I moved along the shoreline, I spotted something unusual. A large piece of driftwood had washed up, and it looked perfect for my next project. I maneuvered closer, planning to tow it back to the cabin. As I leaned over the side to secure it, I heard a voice call out from the shore. "Need a hand?" I turned and saw Sadie standing there, dressed in jeans and a heavy sweater, her hair pulled back in a braid today. "What are you doing here?" I asked, surprised. "I figured you'd be out here," she said with a shrug, her eyes meeting mine. "You always come looking for driftwood after a storm." She waded into the shallow water, reaching out to grab the other end of the log. Together we managed to secure it and tow it back to my cabin. As we worked, I found myself watching her, noticing how she'd changed over the years. She wasn't the kid I remembered anymore. There was a confidence in the way she moved, an ease that hadn't been there before. When we finally got the log to shore, she brushed a strand of hair out of her face and smiled. "You should probably teach me how to do this," she said, "in case you fall in again." I laughed. "You'd have to get a lot stronger to pull a log like this by yourself." "You'd be surprised," she replied, her eyes sparkling. We dragged the driftwood to my workshop, and I offered her a cup of coffee as a thank you. "So," she said as we sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, "what's it like living out here all by yourself?" "It's quiet," I said after a moment, "which is exactly what I wanted." "But don't you ever get lonely?" she pressed. I thought about it, thought about the emptiness I'd felt the night before, and how much it had bothered me. "Sometimes," I admitted. Sadie nodded, staring out at the horizon. "I don't think I could ever do it. Be alone, I mean." "You're not as alone as you think," I said, surprising even myself with how honest the words felt. "Sometimes it's harder to be with people than to be by yourself." She looked up at me then, her eyes searching mine. "Do you think you'll ever change your mind?" "About what?" "About being alone." I didn't know how to answer that, so I just sipped my coffee and watched the sun disappear behind the peaks. After a while, Sadie stood up, brushing off her jeans. I should go, she said, though she didn't sound happy about it. My dad will worry. Thanks for your help, I said, standing as well. You know you're welcome here any time. She gave me a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. I'll see you around, Jake. I watched her walk down the path, feeling a strange ache in my chest that I hadn't expected. I knew she'd be back, and that thought gave me more comfort than I was willing to admit. That evening, as I was finishing up dinner, there was a knock on the door. I opened it to find Rachel standing there, looking less put together than the last time I'd seen her. Her hair was loose, falling in waves around her shoulders, and she was wearing a simple jacket and jeans. She looked almost normal. You again? I said, trying to hide my surprise. Is this a bad time? She asked, shivering slightly. It's colder out here than I thought. I stepped aside, letting her in. What brings you all the way out here? I needed to get out of town, she said, glancing around the cabin. I thought maybe you could use some company. You thought I'd be lonely? I said with a smirk. She laughed softly. No, I just thought maybe I could use a break from people. Fair enough, I replied, offering her a cup of coffee. How do you take it? Black is fine, she said, taking the mug from me. Thanks. We sat in silence for a while, and I was surprised at how comfortable it felt. She didn't fill the space with idle chatter or ask a million questions like I expected. Instead, she just sat there, staring into the fire, sipping her coffee. You don't fit in here, I said finally, watching her carefully. So, why are you here? She sighed, setting her mug down. Honestly, I don't know. I thought coming to Alaska would be this great adventure, but I feel more out of place here than anywhere else. Everyone treats me like I'm some, I don't know, fragile thing that needs to be protected. You're not what they expected, I said. No, she agreed. I guess I'm not. Well, you're welcome to stay for a bit, I offered, surprising myself. If you need a break from it all. She gave me a small smile. Thanks, Jake. That means a lot. We talked for a while longer, and for the first time since meeting her, I felt like I was seeing the real Rachel. She told me about growing up in California, how she'd started acting when she was just a kid, and how exhausting it all was sometimes. I shared a bit about my past, about why I'd come to Alaska, and why I chose this solitary life. It felt good to talk, to share pieces of myself that I'd kept locked away for so long. As the night wore on, Rachel's eyelids grew heavy, and I offered to let her stay in the guest room. She agreed, and I watched as she made her way down the narrow hallway, wondering how this city girl had ended up in my cabin, in my life. The next morning, I woke early and went outside to gather firewood, trying to clear my head. When I returned, I found Rachel in the kitchen, attempting to make coffee. She glanced up, looking embarrassed. I couldn't figure out how to work your coffee maker, she confessed. I chuckled. It's a little old-fashioned. I took over, showing her how to use it, and she watched with genuine interest. As the aroma of fresh coffee filled the kitchen, Rachel leaned against the counter and asked, Why did you come here, Jake? To Homer, I mean. What were you running from? I paused, considering how much I wanted to share. I wasn't running, I finally replied. I was searching for a place that felt real, somewhere I could just be myself. It's not easy finding that. She nodded thoughtfully. I get that. You'd be surprised how hard it is to be yourself when everyone expects you to be someone else. I handed her a steaming mug and shrugged. It's not about what others expect, Rachel. It's about what you want, what you need. She looked at me with a softness that caught me off guard. What do you need, Jake? I stared into my coffee, avoiding her gaze. I don't know, I admitted, but I'm figuring it out. The day passed quietly after that. Rachel stayed at the cabin, helping me with some of the work around the place. I was surprised at how willing she was to get her hands dirty. She even chopped a bit of wood, although not very successfully, and I couldn't help but laugh at her attempts. Hey, I'm trying, she protested, a smile playing on her lips. Trying doesn't always get the job done, I teased back, taking the axe from her and showing her the proper way to split the wood. She watched me carefully, her expression serious as she tried to mimic my movements. There was something endearing about her determination, the way she refused to let her lack of experience get the better of her. For a moment, I wondered what it would be like to have someone like Rachel around more often. Someone who wasn't afraid to learn, to make mistakes. By the time the sun began to set, Rachel had managed to split a few logs, and we stacked the wood together in silence. As the sky turned a deep shade of orange, I felt a sense of peace wash over me, one I hadn't felt in a long time. "You know," Rachel said quietly, "I never thought I'd find this kind of beauty out here. I thought Alaska was just cold and empty." "It can be," I agreed, "but it's also full of life if you know where to look." She turned to me then, her eyes reflecting the colors of the sunset. "Thank you, Jake," she said softly, "for letting me see it." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and we stood there, side by side, watching the day fade into night. A few days later, I took Rachel into town, so she could catch a flight back to Los Angeles. As we walked down the dock, I saw Sadie standing by the bait shop, her eyes narrowing when she spotted us together. I knew I'd have to explain, but I didn't know how. "Who's that?" Rachel asked, noticing the tension. "Someone important," I replied honestly. "Someone I've known for a long time." "Ah," Rachel said, her tone unreadable. "Well, I hope she knows how lucky she is." One afternoon we took a walk down to the beach, where the tide had left behind a new batch of driftwood. Sadie pointed to a piece shaped like a twisted branch and said, "That one's perfect." "For what?" I asked, curious. "For a sign," she replied, picking it up and examining it. "You need a name for this place, something that says, 'Home.'" I thought about it for a moment, then smiled. "How about Second Chances?" Sadie looked up, her eyes meeting mine, and for a moment, I saw everything I'd ever wanted reflected back at me. "I like that," she said softly. "I like that a lot." We brought the driftwood back to the cabin, and over the next few days, I carved the name into it, letting each stroke of the chisel remind me of how far I'd come, how much I'd changed. It was a few months later when I received an unexpected letter from Rachel. She wrote about how much that brief time in Homer had meant to her, how it had helped her see what truly mattered in life. She was leaving Hollywood, moving back to her hometown, and starting over. At the end of the letter she wrote, "You taught me that it's never too late to find yourself, Jake. Thank you for that." I folded the letter and tucked it away, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. Rachel had found her path, just as I had found mine. That evening, as Sadie and I sat by the fire, her head resting on my shoulder, I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. This was my life now. A life I'd fought hard to build, with a woman who had taught me how to love again. "Jake?" Sadie's voice broke the silence, soft and steady. "Do you think you'll ever want more than this? More than just this cabin and the woods?" I kissed the top of her head, smiling against her hair. "As long as I have you, Sadie, I have everything I'll ever need." And as the fire crackled and the stars began to fill the sky, I knew that, for the first time, I'd found the one place where I truly belonged. Winter rolled in sooner than expected that year, blanketing the land in a thick layer of snow. The nights grew longer and the days were cold and crisp. Sadie stayed with me most weekends, and sometimes during the week too, when the roads weren't too icy. I didn't respond, and Rachel didn't press me. Instead, she gave me a quick hug before boarding the plane, leaving me standing there, watching her fly off into the distance. I felt a strange sense of loss, even though I knew I'd probably never see her again. Sadie approached me as the plane disappeared into the sky. "So, was she another one of your adventures?" she asked, her tone sharper than usual. "No," I said, turning to face her. "Just someone passing through." Sadie folded her arms across her chest, her gaze hard. "And what about me, Jake? Am I just passing through too?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "No," I said finally. "You're different." She stepped closer, her eyes searching mine. "Then why do you keep pushing me away?" "Because I'm afraid," I admitted. "Afraid of what might happen if I let myself care too much." "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard," she snapped. But her voice softened as she reached out to take my hand. "Life is too short to be afraid, Jake. You taught me that." Her words hit me harder than I expected, and before I could stop myself, I pulled her into my arms and kissed her. It was a kiss that felt like years in the making, filled with all the unspoken words and hidden feelings that had built up over time. When we finally pulled away, Sadie was smiling, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Took you long enough," she whispered, resting her forehead against mine. "Yeah," I agreed, my voice hoarse. "I guess I'm a little slow sometimes." She laughed, and it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. The days that followed were some of the happiest I'd known. Sadie became a regular presence at the cabin, helping me with my projects, teaching me things I'd never thought I'd need to know, like how to dance under the stars or how to bake bread from scratch. We spent our evenings by the fire, sharing stories and dreams for the future, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't just surviving. I was living. She brought over warm blankets and extra supplies, always making sure we had enough to get through the harsh weather. One particularly cold night, as the wind howled outside, we sat by the fire, sharing a bottle of whiskey that John had given me as thanks for saving his daughter. Sadie was curled up next to me, her feet tucked under my legs for warmth. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked suddenly. "Miss what?" "The life you left behind," she said, studying me. "The one before you came here." I thought about it for a moment, staring into the flickering flames. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but only because it reminds me of how far I've come." Sadie nodded, leaning her head on my shoulder. "You know, I don't think I ever told you, but I've always admired you." "For what?" I asked, genuinely curious. "For having the courage to leave," she said softly. "For starting over when it would have been easier to just stay where you were." "I didn't have a choice," I replied. "If I'd stayed, I would have lost myself." "Maybe," she said, "but you didn't have to come all the way out here to find yourself. You could have gone anywhere." "I came here because it felt right," I said, pulling her closer. "And now, I know I made the right decision." She smiled up at me, and in that moment, I felt something shift between us, something that had been quietly growing for months, but now took root. This wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was real, solid, like the mountains that surrounded us. As the months passed, we settled into our own version of a normal life. We'd spend mornings working around the cabin and afternoons exploring the woods, sometimes fishing on the lake, and always finding some way to make each day feel different from the last. In the spring, I finally finished the sign Sadie and I had started. "Second Chances" was carved into the driftwood, and together, we hung it above the doorway of the cabin. I watched as she stood back to admire it, the wind blowing her hair across her face, and I couldn't help but feel that in all the ways that mattered, this was now her home as much as it was mine. One day, while I was fixing a loose shingle on the roof, I saw a familiar figure walking up the path. It was John, and I climbed down to meet him, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Jake," he greeted, extending a hand. "How's the cabin holding up?" "Better than ever," I replied, shaking his hand. "What brings you out here?" "Just wanted to check in," he said, looking around the property. "And to tell you something." "Oh?" He took a deep breath, and I noticed how the lines on his face had softened. "You're good for her, you know. For Sadie. I've seen how she's changed since she started spending time out here." "I care about her," I said honestly. "More than I thought I could care about anyone." John nodded, his eyes meeting mine. "Then don't let her go." I felt a lump form in my throat, and I just nodded, unable to find the right words. John clapped me on the shoulder and then turned to leave, his words hanging in the air long after he'd gone. A few weeks later, as summer began to spread its warmth across the land, I took Sadie out to the spot on the bluff where we'd first stood together months earlier. The view was just as breathtaking, the mountains painted in shades of blue and green, the ocean sparkling in the sunlight. "You never get tired of this, do you?" Sadie asked, her voice full of wonder. "Never," I replied, taking her hand in mine. "And there's something else I'll never get tired of." She turned to look at me, her eyes searching mine. "What's that?" "You," I said simply. "Every single day." Sadie smiled, and I saw her eyes fill with tears. "Jake? What are you trying to say?" "I'm saying," I began, my voice catching, "that you're my second chance, and I don't want to waste a single moment of it." I pulled a small, simple ring from my pocket and held it out to her. "Marry me, Sadie." She stared at the ring for a moment, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought she might say no. But then she smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes." I slipped the ring onto her finger, my hands shaking, and we stood there wrapped in each other's arms as the wind carried our laughter out to sea. We married that fall, surrounded by the friends we'd made in town and a few members of Sadie's family who'd flown in for the occasion. The ceremony was simple, held on the beach at sunset, with the waves crashing behind us and the mountains standing tall in the distance. Rachel even sent a gift, an intricately carved wooden box with a note that read, "For keeping your heart open." I couldn't help but smile as I tucked the note away, grateful for the path that had brought me here, to this moment. That night, as we sat around a bonfire, our friends laughing and toasting to our future, Sadie leaned in and whispered, "I love you, Jake. More than anything." "I love you too," I replied, kissing her softly. "And I promise, no matter what happens, I'll always be here." She smiled against my lips. "And I promise I'll never leave." And as we sat there, wrapped in each other's warmth, I knew that this was what I'd been searching for all along. A second chance, a place to belong, and a love that felt as vast and unending as the Alaskan sky.